You won't believe the battle I'm dealing with in my new Swedish home. It's not just about the rent, the kitchen chaos, or the frustrating landlord. It's the silent war over the smallest, pettiest things that's making my life a living nightmare. And let me tell you, it's getting out of control. Moving to a foreign country for an internship is already a massive leap. But when you're 21 and trying to get your life together, especially in a country as expensive as Sweden, things get a lot trickier. I had secured an internship, but it was unpaid because who doesn't love the opportunity to work for free, right? So the next challenge was finding somewhere to live. And when I say somewhere, I mean finding anything that wasn't a ridiculous price for a tiny closet. Now, the biggest roadblock I ran into was the dreaded Swedish bank ID. To do anything from renting a room to even buying groceries, you need a Swedish bank account. But guess what? You can't open a bank account unless you have a Swedish address. And you can't get an address unless you've already got the bank ID. It's like they just want to make you run in circles for fun. Sweden, I love you, but seriously. After days of feeling like I was trapped in some sort of bureaucratic limbo, I eventually found a room in a small city about an hour from Gothenburg. Now, this wasn't exactly the most convenient location for commuting, but beggars can't be choosers. The city had a population of about 10,000 people, and it felt like a quaint little place. But as any seasoned intern knows, when you're strapped for cash, the distance from your work is something you just learn to deal with. The rent? €340 a month, all inclusive. This might sound like a steal, and at first I thought it was. I mean, Sweden is expensive, so I wasn't going to question the price too much. Plus, after the hassle of finding a place, I didn't care if it was a bit far out. What's an hour on public transport, right? It's probably just a minor inconvenience, something you can endure. Or so I thought. I signed the lease, got the key, and moved in. Everything seemed fine on the surface, until I saw the place. The room itself was small, 10 square meters to be exact. Tiny but manageable. The house was shared with a roommate and the landlord who lived downstairs. At first glance, it seemed okay. But there was something off about it. The room wasn't just small, it felt a little too lived in, not in the cozy, warm way. No, this was a more unsettling kind of lived in. The walls, for example, were covered with some interesting children's drawings, which I assumed were from previous tenants, but it still felt strange. Like I was living in someone's abandoned childhood room. And the stains on the walls? Yeah, those weren't just there for decoration. But the real kicker came when I saw the kitchen. Or should I say the kitchen nightmare? It was an absolute disaster, filled with clutter, stains, and a smell that can only be described as wet dog with a side of mildew. Now, I'm not a perfectionist, but I do like a clean space to cook in. This wasn't a kitchen. It was more of a war zone. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't the end of the world. Maybe I could just clean it up and make it livable? But the reality hit me hard. This wasn't just messy, it was unlivable. At that point, I was already questioning my decision to move in. But hey, I had signed the lease, and I couldn't go back now. Besides, I was here for the internship, and complaining about a tiny room or a filthy kitchen wasn't going to get me anywhere. So I gritted my teeth, tried to adapt, and carried on. But deep down I knew this was going to be a problem. The stage was set for the drama that was about to unfold. And trust me, it was just the beginning. When I first saw the room, I thought I had struck gold. I mean, €340 per month, all utilities included, for a place in Sweden. A dream come true, right? The photos online didn't seem terrible, and the description of the room made it sound cozy enough for me to squeeze into, even though I wasn't expecting luxury. But sometimes, when you're trying to find the cheapest option in a foreign country, your expectations need to be, well, a bit lower than usual. The room itself was compact, 10 square meters of space, which, when you think about it, isn't a lot at all. But what can you expect when you're a young intern trying to stretch your budget as far as possible? A small room was fine. I could work with that. But when I unlocked the door for the first time and stepped inside, I instantly felt off. The first thing I noticed was the walls. Now, most people probably wouldn't think twice about the walls of a rented room, but there was something so jarring about these. They were covered in children's drawings and not in a cute, oh, this is the landlord's kid's art kind of way. These were abstract scribbles and stick figures that looked like they'd been up for years. Some of them were even fading and peeling off. Maybe it was a quirk, I thought. Maybe the previous tenant had kids who got a little too creative. But it was the kind of thing that made you feel like you were living in a room that wasn't meant to be rented out. It was too personal. Too weird. And as I glanced around the room more, I noticed the stains on the walls. They weren't huge, but they were there, random, brownish stains that didn't exactly scream clean and cared for. It didn't take a genius to figure out that the room had been lived in by someone who wasn't too concerned about the state of things. I couldn't help but think that this was going to be a pain to deal with, but hey, I was already there. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, right? Just a couple of minor annoyances. I could work with it. The furniture in the room wasn't exactly high-end either. It was basic and old wooden bed frame, a desk that looked like it had been around for decades, and a wardrobe that made the bed frame look like a piece of modern art. The wardrobe was a strange, one solid wood, but way too bulky for the space. I couldn't even fully open the door without hitting the bed. It was almost as if the room had been furnished with second-hand pieces that were just good enough to fill the space, not things someone had actually thought about when setting up a rental room. But at the end of the day, I was paying €340, which wasn't terrible. So I decided not to let the room's eccentricities get to me. Sure, it was a little cramped, but I figured that was just part of the deal when you're looking for a cheap place in Sweden. Besides, I could make it work. I brought my things in and tried to settle in. I even put a few decorative touches in my room to give it some personality. It was small, but it was mine for now. However, the room itself wasn't the biggest issue. The moment that really hit me came when I started to realize that the shared areas of the house were where the real problems lay. But before we get into that, let's circle back to the room itself for a moment. It wasn't just that the room was a bit rundown, it was that the lack of attention to detail was everywhere. The more I looked at the bed frame, the more I noticed that it had squeaky springs. Every time I rolled over, I felt like I was announcing to the entire house, "Hey, I'm awake!" That's not even getting into the thin walls, which meant that you could hear every sound from downstairs, including the landlord's constant pacing or her overly dramatic conversations. Then the real fun started. The smell. Now, I'm not a delicate person. I've stayed in places that smelled less than ideal before. But this was something else. It wasn't bad in my room specifically, but when I opened the door to walk down the hallway to the shared areas, the air was thick with a strange, almost musty odor. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it wasn't fresh either. It was a combination of wet socks and something animal. I later found out that the landlord had a dog, but honestly, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the smell lingered everywhere downstairs too. The house had that damp, slightly moldy vibe to it, and it wasn't just in my room. The ground floor smelled like wet dog most of the time, which was not ideal. To be clear, I love dogs. But when the scent is so overpowering that it creeps into your room and stays with you, it starts to become a problem. It was hard to enjoy any space in the house without that funky, wet dog smell taking over. The room itself, with its outdated furniture and strange decor, was just the beginning of what I was slowly realizing was going to be an uncomfortable, claustrophobic living situation. But, as they say, it's just temporary. I kept telling myself that. This was only for a few months. The smell, the weird stains, the less than ideal room, it was all just a small sacrifice to make my internship work. What else could I do? I was already here. I couldn't exactly pack up and leave. And honestly, I was trying to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed at first. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. So, here's the thing, I can handle a messy room. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. I can deal with strange stains on the walls, and even the odd smell from the damp ground floor. But when it comes to the kitchen, that's a different story. This was a deal breaker. I didn't expect a Michelin-starred setup, but what I encountered, well, it could only be described as an absolute nightmare. You'd think a kitchen was supposed to be a space where you can cook, eat, and enjoy the simple pleasures of food. But in this house, the kitchen felt more like a war zone, a place of chaos and disorder that made even the idea of boiling an egg feel like an obstacle course. When I first walked into the kitchen, I was met with an overwhelming sense of anxiety. The place was packed with stuff, everywhere. It wasn't even just that there were too many dishes, there was stuff everywhere. Plates, bowls, cups, knives, forks, spoons piled high, spilling out from cupboards, drawers, and counters. Everything had been shoved into any available space, regardless of whether or not it made sense. It was like no one had even tried to make the space functional. You had to play Tetris just to find a spot to chop an onion. And that's the thing, it wasn't just clutter. It was disgusting clutter. I've seen messes in kitchens before, sure. But this was something else. For starters, there was a cutting board sitting on the counter with crumbs stuck to it. The kind of crumbs that looked like they had been there for days. Weeks even. Just sitting there, ignored as if they had become part of the decor. And then there was the dog food, yes, dog food on the counter. Directly on the counter, as if it was just another ingredient waiting to be mixed into the next meal. I'm not even sure why, but seeing dry dog food sitting on the kitchen counter made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if it was just disorganization or pure neglect. Either way, it was deeply unsettling. The cabinets were another issue. You couldn't open one without something falling out. Things were crammed in there so tightly that it seemed like there was no rhyme or reason to how anything was stored. Pots, pans, mugs, and plastic containers were stacked on top of each other in the most precarious way. And don't even get me started on the pans. The pots and pans looked like they hadn't seen a good cleaning in months, maybe years. The bottom of the frying pans were coated in a 1/4 centimeter layer of carbonized food. Some of the pans had so much burnt food on them that they looked like a science experiment. I tried to tell myself, okay, I'll just clean them, it's fine. But deep down I knew it wasn't just a quick wipe down that was needed. These pans were beyond help. They needed a full-on renovation. And yet, despite all the chaos and filth, my landlord and roommate used these pans regularly. It was almost as if they were immune to the state of their own kitchen. They didn't seem to mind the sticky residue, the gunky leftovers on every surface, or the smell of something burning from last week's meal. To them, it was just part of life. But to me, this wasn't just gross. This was unhygienic, and I couldn't ignore it. Every time I tried to cook something, I felt like I was battling the kitchen itself. Should I risk using a pan that looked like it could be harboring germs from the medieval era? Or should I just give up and eat another sandwich? The whole vibe of the kitchen was just wrong. You couldn't move 2 steps without being reminded of the neglect. There were crumbs on the counters that never seemed to get wiped away, greasy fingerprints on every cupboard door, and dirty dish racks overflowing with wet, soggy dishes. I'm no clean freak, but this was getting borderline hygienic disaster territory. How could anyone live like this? How could they not see it? I'll admit, I tried to keep my cool. I knew it wasn't my place to start demanding that everything be scrubbed down to perfection. But after a few days of trying to cook in a kitchen where you couldn't even find a clean space to chop vegetables, I started feeling my blood boil. The first time I went to use the oven, I found it stuffed with dirty pans. Not just the oven's interior, literally inside the oven, piled high, as though the oven was just another storage unit. I couldn't believe it. Who puts dirty cookware in an oven? It wasn't just inconvenient, it was insane. And the smells? The kitchen had this undercurrent of stale food and grease that never quite went away. I figured it was the aftermath of someone just living in the kitchen rather than using it for cooking, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Every time I opened the fridge, I was greeted by a weird sour odor that lingered like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't awful, but it wasn't pleasant either. The fridge had spills that had been there for God knows how long, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was the standard living situation around here. As much as I tried to stay calm, it was obvious that I couldn't live like this. I liked cooking, but this wasn't just about cooking anymore. This was about basic hygiene and being able to live in a place without feeling like you were stepping into a hazard zone every time you needed to eat. And let us not even talk about the smell that seemed to invade everything, especially after the wet dog air from downstairs made its way up into the kitchen. But here's where things took a turn. Despite all of the filth, despite the grossness that greeted me every time I stepped into the kitchen, my landlord would still find the smallest things to complain about. She would send me passive-aggressive messages about washing dishes. immediately after use and putting things back in their proper place even though her kitchen was a mess. She insisted on cleaning things a certain way, but didn't hold herself to the same standard. It became clear that her idea of clean was about control, not about maintaining a space that was actually livable. And that, my friends, was the real problem. The kitchen wasn't just dirty, it was a symbol of the discrepancy between what she expected from me and what she was willing to offer in return. Her space was a mess, and yet I was constantly under scrutiny for every little thing I did. That wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. I was already dealing with the chaos and grime, and now I had to fight against her ever-present demands. It was time for a change. But change, in this case, would be subtle, strategic, and, if I was being honest, just a little bit petty. By now, you'd think that a situation like mine living in a cramped, dirty, and chaotic house couldn't possibly get worse, right? Well, that's where I was wrong. The most frustrating part wasn't even the physical space. It wasn't the stains on the walls, the dog food on the counter, or the rancid smell that seemed to permeate the entire house. It was the rules. More specifically, the hypocrisy behind those rules. My landlord, who clearly didn't have her own house under control, had a lot of opinions about how I should manage my space and the shared kitchen. She had an alarming tendency to treat the house like it was her domain, despite the fact that I was paying rent to live there. And while I would have expected a landlord to enforce rules that kept the place clean and livable, the only rules she seemed to care about were rules about me. For instance, the first day I arrived, I was bombarded with a list of demands that seemed innocuous at first. But as time went on, I began to see the control she was trying to exert. The first major rule I encountered was that everything I borrowed in the kitchen should be washed and returned immediately after use. Okay, fair enough. I get it. It's common courtesy to wash your dishes and put things back where you found them. But here's the thing, I always wash my dishes within 24 hours. I'm not a perfect person, and I don't have an issue with putting things away when they're clean. But what bothered me was that it wasn't enough for her to expect me to wash things in a reasonable amount of time. It was the immediate return part that felt like overkill. I didn't see the issue with leaving a few things in the sink or on the counter for a few hours, especially since there was no drying rack in the kitchen to place them on. I mean, how could I just put things back without them being wet and dripping all over the place? If I tried to wash everything in one go, I'd have a pile of wet dishes sitting on the counter, which would only make the mess worse. But no, she insisted that everything be put back immediately. And even though I tried to comply, there was always some subtle, passive-aggressive remark about it. And here's the kicker, her kitchen was a disaster. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the state of the kitchen was more chaotic than anything I had ever seen. The counter space was filled with half-used bags of flour, scattered spices, and piles of dirty dishes. The cabinets were packed to the brim with mismatched dishes and utensil stuff you'd never think to put together. There was so much stuff crammed into every available space that the kitchen didn't feel like a cooking space, it felt like a dumping ground. So when she scolded me for not immediately putting things away or for leaving a few dirty dishes out for a couple of hours, I couldn't help but wonder, how could she possibly expect me to adhere to such strict rules when she clearly didn't follow them herself? But it didn't stop there. Oh no, she also had a bizarre obsession with where I put things. She had this almost pathological need to ensure that everything in the kitchen was placed exactly how she wanted it. Every utensil had a designated spot, and every pot and pan had to be placed in a precise location. She insisted that if I borrowed something from her kitchen, I had to put it back in the exact spot where it came from. And I'm not talking about a general guideline here. No, it had to be in the exact same spot. If I didn't, I would inevitably be greeted with a snarky remark or a passive-aggressive comment. To add to the absurdity, her kitchen was so overcrowded that finding any actual space to cook became an exercise in frustration. The pans were crammed into the oven, the cabinets were bursting with excess dishes, and there was barely any room to prepare anything without rearranging the clutter first. Despite this, she insisted that I put things back precisely. So, while I was trying to navigate this jungle of kitchenware and attempt to cook something, I would inevitably be interrupted by her voice. reminding me that my cutting board or knife wasn't in its rightful place. It got worse when I had to deal with her hypocrisy around the mixing bowl. One time, I used the mixing bowl to prepare something, and once I was done, I left it on the counter to dry. I wasn't tea-hogging it or making a mess, I was just trying to get the damn thing clean. She walked in, took one look at the bowl, and, with a sigh, remarked that she didn't want it left there taking up space. Fair enough. I thought it was a bit of an overreaction, but I respected it and moved the bowl into the cupboard where it belonged. Here's where it got interesting. A week later, while I was upstairs in the mini kitchen I shared with my roommate, I noticed something odd. My landlord had snooped around in the cupboards and noticed the mixing bowl had been left out earlier. So she sent me an angry message telling me not to hog utensils upstairs, even though she had 3 other identical bowls. I was confused. Was I not allowed to use any kitchen equipment, even if I was following all the rules? How could she complain about something so minor when she had plenty of spare equipment herself? But she didn't seem to see it that way. Instead, I was being reprimanded for using something that, quite frankly, I had no reason not to use. As if that wasn't annoying enough, there was the whole issue with the sponge. I'm sure I've mentioned before how much of a hassle the kitchen was, but this next incident really took the cake. One day, after cleaning the dishes, I went to grab the sponge to finish the job, and where was it? Nowhere to be found. I asked my landlord if she knew where it was, and she gave me a smug reply. Oh, it's in a cupboard upstairs. You're supposed to take it back to your room when you're done with it. Wait, what? I had to take the sponge back to my room? It was just a sponge, but sure enough, that was the rule. When I went to get the sponge the next day, guess where I found it? Sitting on the stairs along with my dish soap. Her little passive-aggressive move wasn't just annoying, it was also baffling. Why was she so obsessed with controlling the sponge and dish soap when the rest of the house was in complete disarray? It was moments like these that made it crystal clear. My landlord wasn't concerned about keeping the house clean or maintaining order. She wasn't trying to be fair, she was trying to control me. She wasn't making sure the house was in a livable state for both of us. Instead, she was obsessed with enforcing her own standards without taking any responsibility for the condition of her own space. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about power. What was most maddening was that I was paying rent. I wasn't a guest in her house, but she acted like I was. I was paying for my room, and yet I was treated like I had no say in the space I was supposed to be living in. It was as if my comfort and peace of mind didn't matter, only her need to feel in control. And that, my friends, was the true hypocrisy of the situation. She was running a house that felt more like a personal project than a livable rental space, and her obsession with every little detail just reinforced the power dynamics at play. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about control over how I lived, what I used, and how I should behave. And in the end, that's what I found most frustrating. Because no matter how many dishes I washed or how many pans I put away in her exact, prescribed location, it was never enough. By now, I had already come to terms with the fact that my landlord had a certain unique way of running things. The kitchen was a disaster zone, her rules were out of control, and her behavior was bordering on controlling. I was doing my best to stay under the radar, trying to keep my head down and just get through my internship. But there was one thing that really took the cake and pushed me even further into the world of frustration: the bike incident. You see, as I was settling into life in this small Swedish town, I realized that public transport wasn't always the most convenient option. Sure, it was affordable, but the idea of spending an hour each way on the bus to get to work was starting to feel like too much. I needed an alternative. That's when I thought maybe I could just rent a bike to make life easier. It seemed like a reasonable solution, especially since I had heard from colleagues that bikes were a pretty common way to get around. So one day, I casually brought up the idea of renting a bike from my landlord. It wasn't like I had a lot of options. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just something basic to help me get from point A to point B without having to rely on the bus every single day. That's when she hit me with the most absurd offer I had ever heard. She told me that she had a bike I could rent, but the catch: it would cost me 50 per month. Yes, €50 per month to rent a bike. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. I mean, I had seen used bikes for sale around town for half that price, and that was the cost to buy one. Why on earth would I pay €50 every month when I could buy a second-hand bike, use it for a few months, and then sell it for almost the same price? It didn't make sense. I tried to explain this to her. I told her that I could buy a bike and probably resell it when I was done with it, which would save me a ton of money. But she wasn't having it. "It's my bike," she said. "I can charge whatever I want." And that was that. I was stunned. I mean, this was a person who couldn't even be bothered to clean the kitchen. Yet she thought it was acceptable to charge someone €50 a month for a used bike that I could literally pick up for half that price at any local flea market. Her logic made zero sense, and it wasn't even like she was offering me some high-end brand new bike. This was just a regular old bike, probably an antique at this point. I felt like I was being completely taken advantage of. Naturally, I vented to a few colleagues about this situation, trying to make sense of it all. And here's where the true nature of my landlord's reputation came to light. Apparently, she was known as the cheapskate of the village. The kind of person who would try to squeeze every penny out of anyone who crossed her path. It wasn't just me, everyone knew that she had a tendency to overcharge for things or try to nickel and dime her tenants. Hearing this made me feel a little bit better. At least I wasn't the only one dealing with her ridiculousness. But that wasn't the only instance where my landlord's controlling nature started to rear its ugly head. After the bike incident, I realized this woman had a habit of manipulating situations and imposing her will in the most bizarre ways. One of the most infuriating things was how she constantly demanded that I follow her rules to the letter, despite the fact that she wasn't willing to make the smallest adjustments herself. It was like she lived by this idea that she had the right to dictate every aspect of my life. But when it came to her own behavior, nothing had to change. Take the kitchen, for example. As I've mentioned, it was an absolute disaster, and it wasn't like I was the only one using it. But every time I left a dish out for a little too long, just a few hours or so, she'd send me a passive-aggressive message, scolding me for not putting things away immediately. As though I was single-handedly ruining the state of the kitchen, even though she was the one who hadn't cleaned the grease off the stove in weeks. It felt like I was being unfairly blamed for every little mess, while she seemed perfectly content to ignore her own contribution to the chaos. There was also the issue of her randomly hiding my stuff. A couple of weeks after moving in, I realized something strange. My sponge and dish soap kept going missing. They weren't being borrowed. They were vanishing as if someone had decided they didn't belong where I'd left them. It didn't take long for me to realize that my landlord was the culprit. Every time I'd ask her about the sponge or soap, she'd deny having moved them, even though it was obvious that they hadn't just disappeared on their own. It was as if she was playing a game of hide-and-seek with my basic kitchen supplies. The most bizarre example of her controlling nature came one afternoon when I was preparing to cook dinner. I had left a mixing bowl out to dry on the counter, something I had done dozens of times without issue. But the next morning, I came downstairs to find the bowl shoved into the cupboard, out of sight and, for some reason, with a weird note attached, "Please don't leave things out to dry." This wasn't just about cleanliness, this was about control. It was moments like these that started to drive me mad. It wasn't just the kitchen, or the bike situation, or her ridiculous rules. It was the fact that everything I did seemed to annoy her, and yet she wasn't held to the same standards. I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid any situation where she might send me another scolding message. It felt like she was nitpicking every little thing I did, controlling my every move, while she lived in a house that was clearly falling apart around her. At that point, I started to realize that this wasn't just about me following her rules. This was about her exerting dominance over me. She was trying to make me feel small, making sure that every action I took was met with her disapproval or criticism. It was exhausting, and honestly, it felt suffocating. Every time I thought things might get better, she would come up with another way to assert her authority, reminding me that I was just a tenant in her eyes, not someone who had a say in the house I was living in. Living under the constant control of my landlord was exhausting. She had turned every mundane task into an opportunity for criticism. No matter how hard I tried to comply, no matter how much I bent over backward to keep the peace, it was never enough. It felt like I was being suffocated by her expectations, and she didn't even seem to care about the real issues like the disgusting state of the kitchen or her inability to respect the shared space. I wasn't just tired of being told how to live. I was fed up with her hypocrisy. She was always quick to point out any little thing I did wrong, but when it came to her own behavior, there was no accountability. It was clear that she didn't care about cleanliness or order, she cared about control. She wanted to dictate every aspect of my day, from how I washed my dishes to where I put the sponge. And honestly, I was done being her punching bag. So, in the face of this constant control, I did what any frustrated person would do. I started pushing back. But I wasn't about to create a scene. I knew I couldn't directly confront her without things getting ugly, especially with her passive-aggressive nature. So I took a different approach. Petty rebellion. Small, quiet, little acts of defiance that would, in the long run, give me some semblance of control over my own life. Let's start with the sponge. Oh, the sponge. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with this arrangement. My landlord had somehow made it her mission to make sure the sponge was never in its rightful place. She'd hide it, move it around, and even tell me that it needed to be stored in my room after every use. I'd ask her where it was, and she'd innocently say she didn't know, as though she hadn't been the one moving it all along. One day, after yet another round of being scolded for not following the rules regarding the sponge, I decided it was time to take things into my own hands. Instead of putting it back on the counter or hiding it in some random cupboard, I started leaving it in the bathroom. Why not? The bathroom had a sink, and I wasn't going to be dictated by her rules about where my cleaning supplies should go. It was a minor act, but every time I'd use the sponge, I'd leave it in the bathroom. It wasn't in her precious kitchen, and I wasn't breaking any laws, the best part. She never said anything directly about it. But I could see the irritation building behind her eyes whenever she realized that her sponge wasn't where it should be. She couldn't exactly tell me what to do with my sponge anymore, so I silently won the battle. Then there was the issue of the pans. Her instructions were clear. Every time I used one, I needed to wash it immediately and put it back in its designated spot. That was all well and good, except her pans were absolutely disgusting. Every single one had layers of burnt-on food that looked like it had been sitting there for years. You could practically scrape the history of her terrible cooking habits off the surface. So, one day, after washing my dishes, I decided to play the game just a little bit. Instead of putting the pans away perfectly clean, I left them sitting on the counter. I didn't leave them covered in food or anything, but I didn't scrub them spotless like I usually did. I left them just slightly dirty, just enough to make her notice. It wasn't so bad that she could say anything directly, but it was clear that they weren't up to her impossibly high standards. At first, I didn't think much of it. But when she started grumbling about the state of the pans, how they needed to be put away properly, and washed right away, I knew I had struck a nerve. It wasn't about the pans, really. It was about me challenging her demand for perfection and control over every little detail. She couldn't tell me how to clean the pans without sounding ridiculous, so instead she just grumbled. And that, in itself, was satisfying. I had already experienced a bit of drama over a mixing bowl earlier in my time at her house. I had left the bowl out to dry, and she had flipped out. A week later, she snooped around in our upstairs kitchen and found that I had left one of the identical mixing bowls out. So she had sent me a message about hogging utensils. Her response to my perfectly reasonable behavior was so disproportionate that I had to laugh. But the next time the issue of the mixing bowl came up, I knew exactly how to handle it. This time, instead of leaving it to dry on the counter like I did before, I decided to put it in the most inconvenient spot possible. I placed it in the back of the oven just far enough in that she would have to take the whole thing out to get to anything in the oven. And to make sure she noticed, I didn't bother putting it back into the cupboard right away. When she found the bowl later, I knew she would have a fit about it. She had no right to scold me for using a perfectly clean bowl, but I knew it would drive her crazy to see it in such an inconvenient spot. Sure enough, the passive-aggressive comments started rolling in. I kept my responses as polite as possible, almost too polite. The game had officially begun. Next up, the oven. Remember how I mentioned that the pans were often stored inside the oven? Well, my landlord's obsession with the storage arrangement was taken to a whole new level when she would constantly leave dirty pans in there, even though the oven wasn't being used. One day, I took it upon myself to move them. I didn't take them out of the oven entirely, of course, but I rearranged them so that they were blocking the oven door in the most inconvenient way. Not enough to break anything, but just enough to make it harder for her to access the oven when she needed to cook. And sure enough, when she went to bake something the next day, she cursed it under her breath when she found that the pans were no longer where they were supposed to be. I could practically hear her frustration bubbling up. But all I did was move a few things around, things that weren't being used, to make her more aware of how ridiculous her kitchen setup was. I didn't leave a mess. I didn't ruin anything. I simply made it slightly more inconvenient for her to operate in her own kitchen. It was small, but it was satisfying. Every day I found new ways to push back. Small, quiet rebellions. None of them were extreme or even particularly noticeable to anyone but me and the landlord. But they were enough to remind me that I could still control something. I wasn't going to let her petty rules dictate every part of my life. I wasn't going to let her constant criticism break me. Each time I left a pan slightly dirty, placed something in an inconvenient spot, or moved the sponge to the bathroom, it felt like a little victory. I wasn't being outright disrespectful, but I was asserting my independence, and that, in itself, was a form of silent rebellion. By the time I had settled into my routine of petty rebellions, I could feel the tension building. It was as if I had unlocked a new level of passive resistance that I hadn't even known existed. Every little act of defiance was small, but it was a part of a larger, unspoken battle that I was waging against my landlord's controlling behavior. I had gone from feeling completely powerless and suffocated by her rules to quietly turning the tables on her. What started out as tiny rebellions, leaving the sponge in the bathroom, moving a pan just slightly, or hiding the mixing bowl in inconvenient places, had begun to snowball. With each act, I felt more in control of my own environment. It wasn't like I was being disrespectful or disrespecting the rules outright. No, I was just subtly challenging the hypocrisy in her demands. And the best part? She couldn't do a thing about it. But by now, my landlord had started noticing the subtle shifts. I had managed to keep my cool for months. I had found a way to cope with the endless hypocrisy, the controlling behavior, and the mess that seemed to grow every day in the house. My silent rebellions, moving pans around, leaving a dish or two out, hiding the sponge in the bathroom, were my way of pushing back without confrontation. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me a sense of control in a situation where I had very little. But like every pressure cooker, there comes a moment when it all boils over, and I finally hit that point. It started with something small, just another ridiculous complaint from my landlord. I had been in the kitchen, doing what I always did after dinner, cleaning up. The kitchen was, as usual, a disaster zone. The sink was filled with dirty dishes, the counter space was covered in clutter, and there was yet another greasy pan sitting in the oven, taking up space. I had been working on scrubbing the dishes for a while when she walked in, as she often did, to make sure everything was up to her very specific standards. She didn't even greet me. Instead, her eyes immediately darted to the counter and the mess around the sink. She took a deep breath, as if preparing for some big speech. You know, you're supposed to clean up after yourself, right? This isn't your personal kitchen. We all share it. At first, I just nodded, trying to keep my frustration in check. I had heard this line before. But this time, I wasn't prepared for what came next. I don't understand why you keep leaving things out, she continued, her voice growing sharper. You've left the same pan sitting on the counter for days. It's disgusting. You don't want to live in filth, do you? The words stung, even though I knew they weren't true. I had already cleaned it once, and it wasn't my fault that her pan was practically glued together with layers of burnt-on food. And there was that moment, the breaking point, where I felt my restraint snap. I turned to face her, and for the first time, I wasn't going to hide my annoyance. I wasn't going to simply shrug it off. Actually, this kitchen is a mess because of you, I said, my voice calm but firm. You're the one who keeps piling things into the cupboards, cramming everything into the oven and leaving dirty pans everywhere. If you want me to follow your rules, maybe you should start by cleaning up your own mess first. She stopped in her tracks. The words hit her harder than I thought they would. She opened her mouth, clearly surprised, but no words came out. I could see her trying to process what I had just said. It was almost like she was trying to maintain control, but for the first time she didn't know how to react. I could feel the tension in the room, and I had this sudden realization. I didn't need her approval anymore. I didn't need to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I didn't need to keep quiet or bend to her will just to keep the peace. It wasn't worth it. It never had been. But before she could say anything, I added, honestly, I've tried to make this work. I've followed every little rule you've given me, even when they didn't make sense. But I'm done. I'm tired of this. The silence stretched out between us, thick and uncomfortable. Her face turned red, a mixture of anger and frustration washing over her. She was clearly not used to being talked to this way, especially not by a tenant. It was the first time I had challenged her openly, and I could see that it caught her off guard. For a moment, she looked like she might say something to defend herself. Maybe, but she didn't. Instead, she simply muttered, "Well, maybe you should just leave if it's that much of a problem." And just like that, the gloves were off. The dam had broken. There was no going back now. I had been walking on eggshells for so long, biting my tongue and putting up with her petty criticisms, but now it was different. It wasn't about the dirty pans or the cluttered kitchen anymore. It was about how she had treated me like I didn't belong here, like I wasn't paying rent for this space. It was about the way she had constantly tried to control every little thing I did, making me feel like I was walking through a minefield just to stay out of trouble. I took a deep breath, feeling the anger build inside me. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady but with an edge. "Maybe I will. I don't need to be here, and frankly, I don't want to put up with this anymore." Her face twisted in disbelief. It was almost like she couldn't fathom that I, her tenant, would ever dare to push back. It wasn't the reaction she expected, and I could see her struggling to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. I had already made up my mind. I didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. I didn't have to tolerate the constant criticism, the passive-aggressive remarks, or the unreasonable expectations. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking back control. Without another word, I turned around, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the kitchen. I knew I wasn't going to confront her again, not right then. There was nothing more to say. She had shown me who she was, and now I was finally showing her who I was. The next few days were quiet. She didn't approach me directly about our confrontation. Instead, she stayed in her corner, probably trying to figure out how to regain control. But there was nothing more for her to control. I had already mentally checked out, and it felt liberating. The tension in the house had shifted. I could feel it, and so could she. Every time I walked past her, there was this unspoken tension in the air, a sense of distrust and distance that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just that I had stood up to her, it was that I had shown her that I didn't need to follow her rules anymore. I didn't need to put up with her nonsense. And for once I felt free. It wasn't the grand confrontation I had imagined, but it was enough. I didn't need her approval to survive here, and I didn't need to live under her constant scrutiny. The breaking point wasn't just a moment of anger, it was a realization that I had the power to take back my own space. And that, my friends, was the beginning of the end. After my confrontation with the landlord, things were never quite the same. The atmosphere in the house shifted, and I could feel the tension whenever I crossed paths with her. It was as if she had been shocked back into reality, suddenly realizing that she didn't have the same level of control over me that she once did, but there was no going back now. The quiet rebellion that I had been practicing, moving things around, leaving dishes just a little too long, and hiding the sponge, had become a full-blown protest in my mind. Now it was time for subtle revenge. But here's the thing, I wasn't going to throw a tantrum or confront her head-on. That's not how I operated. Instead, I was going to make her feel the same level of discomfort that I had been feeling for the last few months. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to be overt. I didn't need to throw things in her face. The revenge was going to be quiet, strategic, and just a little bit petty. It was time for me to have some fun with this, with a smile. Let's start with something simple. I'd already established that her pans were a source of frustration for both of us. She had insisted they'd be put away immediately. But the reality was that they were all covered in layers of burnt-on food, a permanent fixture in the kitchen. After my last spat with her, I realized something. There was no point in trying to clean her pans any longer. If she wanted them spotless, she could deal with them herself. So every time I used a pan, I left it just dirty enough that it wasn't an emergency, but it was still obvious that it needed to be cleaned. Nothing too extreme, just a light residue of food left on the surface, enough for her to notice, but not enough to cause a full-blown complaint. It was like a gentle reminder that she was responsible for the state of her kitchen, too. I wasn't going to put in the extra effort for her. What made this even more delicious was that she couldn't say anything about it without looking completely ridiculous. She had spent months nitpicking every tiny imperfection of my actions. So what was she going to do? Complain about my dirty pans when her own were in even worse condition? I'll never forget the day I left one of her favorite pans on the counter with a thin layer of burnt food on it, just enough to catch her eye. She walked in, saw it, and immediately scowled. "You really can't keep anything clean, can you?" she said, but there was a hesitation in her voice. She didn't know how to react. She was used to scolding me, but she wasn't expecting the reverse effect. She was the one now staring at her dirty pans, the one she had been using to cook every single day. The best part? She never said anything more about it. She just moved the pan, clearly too proud to admit she was disgusted by her own kitchen. But I knew it had stung. Every time she looked at that pan, she knew I had left it just the way it was on purpose. By this point, the sponge saga had already become an ongoing joke between me and my roommate. Every time I needed to wash something, I'd have to hunt for the sponge. It was like a game of hide and seek, with my landlord playing the role of the secretive game master. She would hide it in random cupboards or, on one occasion, place it in the laundry room, far from the kitchen. But, much like the pans, I was done trying to keep things in her perfect order. One evening, after I had finished doing my dishes, I decided it was time for a little payback. Instead of taking the sponge and putting it back in the kitchen where it belonged, I left it in the bathroom right on the counter, where it was completely out of place. I didn't even hide it in a cupboard or anything subtle. I just left it there, in the open, as if to say, "I'm not playing your game anymore." The next day, she came upstairs, opened the bathroom door, and immediately saw the sponge. She picked it up and gave it a confused look, probably trying to figure out why I would leave it in the bathroom. And then I saw it, the brief flash of frustration in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but I could tell that she was irritated. It wasn't like she could lecture me again. She had already tried that, and I had pushed back in a way that left her speechless. It was a simple move, but it felt like a small victory. I wasn't going to let her control the placement of my cleaning supplies anymore. I was making my point, and she was feeling it, even if she didn't show it. This one was a bit more subtle, but still fun. Over the weeks, I started leaving small, cryptic notes around the house, not directly to her, but clearly intended to be found. They weren't malicious, just enough to disrupt her sense of control without causing an actual confrontation. Sometimes they were written in the tiniest, most innocuous handwriting, but they were designed to unsettle her just enough. The first note appeared in the fridge. It was simple: "Please clean your shelves if you want me to keep mine clean." It wasn't a huge statement, just a gentle reminder that the fridge didn't belong to her alone. The second note was placed on the kitchen counter near the sink. I know it's hard to keep everything in place, but a little effort goes a long way. Each time she found a note, I could see her pause. She couldn't call me out for leaving them because they were so polite. Yet it was impossible to miss the passive-aggressive tone. I wasn't shouting or demanding things from her. I was just leaving her these little reminders that her mess wasn't my responsibility, and if she wanted to complain about my cleaning habits, she could start with her own. Every note seemed to have its effect. Each time she found one, I knew she was growing more and more uncomfortable. I could see her eyes scanning every part of the house for any other subtle signs of rebellion, but she couldn't do anything about it. It was too mild, too polite to confront head-on. And that was the beauty of it, she had no choice but to feel helpless. By this point, I had started getting more strategic. I wasn't just leaving a dirty pan on the counter or hiding the sponge. I was going for something a bit more dramatic, but still subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation. I began to mess with her favorite spot, the oven. She loved using it as a storage space for all her extra pans, as if the oven was just another cupboard. Every time I go to cook, I'd find that it was stuffed full of pans, trays, and pots, many of which were dirty. So one day, after cleaning up in the kitchen, I made a small adjustment. I started placing a few pans in the oven, but not just any pans. I put the ones that she used every day right in the middle of the oven, blocking her from accessing it easily. When she opened the oven the next day to bake something, she was greeted with a minor disaster. Her pans had been moved around in such a way that she had to unload the entire oven to get to her baking trays. The best part? She didn't say a word to me about it. She couldn't possibly complain about something so subtle yet impactful. It wasn't about creating chaos. It was about making her realize how irritating it was to have someone else control the space she thought she owned. Each move I made, each note, every rearranged pan, every misplaced sponge was a reminder to her that she wasn't the only one in control of the space. I wasn't being overly mean, but I was reminding her that I was paying rent too, and I wasn't going to tolerate her behavior any longer. In the end, I realized something crucial. While my time with my landlord had been a frustrating and often draining experience, it had also taught me valuable lessons about asserting my boundaries and reclaiming control over my life. The petty rebellions and subtle acts of revenge were never about sinking to her level or causing chaos for the sake of it. They were about showing her that I would and be her doormat, that I wouldn't let her controlling, hypocritical behavior dominate my life any longer. When I first moved in, I was just trying to make it work. I thought if I kept my head down, did my part, and followed her rules, things would settle into a routine. But I quickly learned that she wasn't interested in fairness or mutual respect. She wanted control, and the only way to gain back a semblance of freedom was to push back quietly but firmly. I didn't want to fight her. That wasn't my goal. What I wanted was to be treated with respect, to live in a space where I wasn't constantly criticized for trivial things. And after months of battling small annoyances and passive-aggressive scolding, I reached a breaking point. I pushed back loudly enough for her to notice, but not so much that I'd be creating a huge scene. And you know what? That's when the tables started to turn. The final moments of subtle payback, whether it was the pan game, the misplaced sponge, or the oven trick, weren't just about getting back at her. They were about making a point that I wasn't going to be controlled, that I had a right to be comfortable in my own space. And in a way, those small acts of defiance gave me the power I didn't know I had. I learned how to stand my ground without being confrontational. I learned that asserting your boundaries doesn't have to be loud or angry. It can be as quiet as a misplaced sponge or a dirty pan left in the oven. By the time I decided it was time to move on, the tension between us had become unbearable. She knew she had lost the power she once had over me, and I knew that there was nothing left for me to prove. I had stood up for myself in the best way I could. It wasn't a dramatic exit, and it didn't involve any grand gestures. I simply left, knowing that I had regained my peace of mind, even if it was in the most passive-aggressive way possible. In the end, moving on wasn't just about leaving the house. It was about leaving behind the feeling of being controlled and realizing that I had the strength to navigate even the most difficult situations. Sometimes all it takes is a little subtle resistance to show that you don't have to tolerate bad behavior, and that was the sweetest kind of victory. Summary: you've survived the petty landlord drama. The small acts of defiance helped ease the frustration, but now it's time to move on. Whether or not you'll stay until the end of your internship, you've learned something about dealing with controlling people sometimes. The best revenge is simply taking the high ground.